Hello and welcome to session 3 of preparing subject leaders for a subject-focused deep dive as part of an Ofsted inspection. Briefly, as I've started each of the sessions, just to recap, the deep dive is in essence a subject-specific review, where over the course of 1.5 to 2 hours, a subject leader and an Ofsted inspector will explore all aspects of teaching and learning of the subject, the identified subject. And majority of these activities, for example, observing learning in practice and looking at evidence of previous learning, i.e. through books or folders, displays, etc., those activities will be done in collaboration with the subject leader. The only two activities that might be done independently of the subject leader would be conversations between an inspector and pupils and with other teachers within the school. But all the conversations about where you are, why you are where you are, and so forth, and what is the impact of the curriculum will be done together between a subject leader and an inspector. Just to recap, this is the third of the 3 sessions, and today's session is about writing a rigorous and robust subject self-evaluation report, which hopefully pulls together the themes that we've picked out from sessions 1 and sessions 2. And just as a quick recap, there is some of the themes that we've explored in sessions 1 and sessions 2. Okay, so launching into this particular session. The report, any report you write about the quality of teaching, learning, and assessment for a subject must be based upon evidence. And the evidence we can gather, the only forms of evidence you and I can gather, is either through learning observations, seeing learning in our subject in practice, talking to children about their learning and their experiences, and reviewing pupils' work, i.e. their past experiences. So those are the activities we can do. And I do strongly suggest that you do the second and the third of those bullet points together, i.e. talking with pupils, but having evidence of their work in front of them. You might want to have as I would, maybe spend a little bit of time looking through any evidence. I've got exercise books, folders, displays, photographs, etc., just to get a flavour of what the children have been engaged in, and then sit down and talk to them about their experiences. And as part of that, I would strongly recommend that you have samples, be it photographs or books, on the table for the children to refer to. It acts as both as a comfort blanket, that they have something there rather than just a blank desk. And it also is an aide-memoire for things that they might not have 100% memory of that they learnt about in the past. The other thing about an evaluation report, it's evaluative. It is not just describing what is taking place. And in terms of evaluation, you're coming down in terms of making a judgment as to whether it is pupils learning and so forth, teaching is good or better, or maybe it's not quite good enough yet, but it is evaluative. You're coming down and making some form of a judgment and not just describing things. And as a result of writing an evaluation report, the direct outcome of that would be an action plan, because anything that you've identified as an even better if is clearly going to feature within an action plan. So please don't do them the other way around, i.e. feeling the need, I must write an action plan because I must be seen to be doing something, because you can only write an action plan once you've gathered some evidence and you've evaluated that evidence. And in a sense, if you just think of this as it's a 4-stage process, but stage 2 is being just stop gathering more information. Once you've had an opportunity to do some monitoring and reviewing, wherever we are in the school year, just take a time out, stop gathering, and start to summarize or evaluate what have I found out so far. What are the what went wells, and is there anything which is an even better if? Because and I'll use that evidence when I start my next round of monitoring and reviewing activities. But having done stage 1 and then stage 2 and summarized it, write up. So it may well be at the end of a term, you start to write some summary findings, and then you add to it at the end of a next term, and then maybe finalize it at the end of the academic year. But stage 4 must come after stage 3. You must actually have gathered some evidence, summarized it before you start to develop an action plan. And again, to repeat the point, it is evaluative. It is not just describing. Lots and lots of reports that one has read over the years describe an awful lot of things that go on within schools, but rarely do they mention what impact, what difference is it making. So yes, you may well be delivering staff meetings and doing staff training, which is great, but to make it even greater, so to speak, at some point after those events, gather some evidence, some feedback to indicate which parts of it were good or better, so to speak, and which parts might still be a work in progress. So I've just put some very crude words up here in a sense. So it is. So when you are evaluating something, you're telling me that it is yes or it is no, in terms of it is in place or it's not quite in place. Actually, the outcomes, it is good. Children's learning is good, or it is better than good, or it might be not quite good enough yet. But it's not. Evaluation is not. It seems like, it appears to be. Because if you're still, as it were, hedging your bets or sitting on a fence by saying it appears to be, but I'm not quite certain, maybe that's a case of that you do need to gather a little bit more evidence so that you can be saying whether it is or it isn't, so to speak. So, and as a result of being able to say whether it is yes, no, not yet, etc., you're moving towards making that judgment about saying what is good or better than good, or what is not quite good enough yet. And you may be saying that because it's not consistently good in all parts of the school. And the last thing I would ever encourage you to do or suggest you do, you don't identify where it's not quite good enough. You would never single out and say, in this particular year group, it is not quite good enough yet. Because those are conversations you'd have had on a one-to-one basis with me as a teacher when you were giving me feedback on having looked at the children's book from my class, or you've looked at children's learning in my class. And it's not a point of actually sort of, personalizing things to such an extent when you write something that we can, particularly where it's not quite good enough, you've got to be clearly really sensitive as to how you present that information. But clearly, if I was a teacher where it was children's learning wasn't quite good enough, we'd have had a conversation, and I'd have been identified some things I could do to make it even better. And no doubt when you're feeding your report back to your senior leaders and your head leaders, clearly they might want to know, understandably, where it's not quite good enough yet. But it's not, I'm not suggesting you put that into the public domain, so to speak. And I mentioned this, the third bullet point in the previous session as well. It is really important to, when looking at a particular question, whatever it is you're asked to respond to, be thinking about what are the command words within that. So, as I said before, you will find in resource 3, there are a whole variety of questions, one of which I know features a number of times is, if not in all of them, can you tell me, so to speak, me being a visitor to your school, what are the best aspects of teaching, learning and assessment in your subject? Now, that question, as you clearly know, is got 3 parts. I want to know the best aspects of teaching, the best aspects of learning, and the best aspects of assessment. So do always make sure that you look to see what is this question really asking me, in order that I give a fulsome response to it. So a bit like we looked at in session 2, let's look at just at some of the criteria. So I've just picked out one of the criteria from the implementation, the quality of education and curriculum implementation section. So it says, teachers have good knowledge of the subject and courses they teach. They provide effective support for those teaching outside their main areas of expertise, which in probably in all reality is every one of you subject leaders out there. There'll be some teachers, class teachers, who are teaching a subject for which they do not feel they're an expert in. But just reading that as a sentence, we may gloss over various aspects of it, which is why in the repeat of it down below, I've just identified what for me are the key command words. So I'd be looking for evidence of, do teachers have good knowledge? Now, it's not just sufficient to say that we do have good knowledge, because we need to see the evidence of that. And likewise, it's not just good enough for me to say, well, as a subject leader, I am providing effective, in fact, I'm providing very effective support to my colleagues. Well, actually, the proof of the pudding is the evidence for that. And I just want to give two little examples on the next slide, on this slide here. We're just saying, so teachers have good knowledge. Where would I find that evidence? How would I be able to demonstrate? Well, it would be through the learner, i.e. the pupil's ability to demonstrate their developing subject knowledge. So by listening to them, by talking to them, by seeing it in practice, I would be able to say the teachers of this subject do have good subject knowledge, because I've seen the evidence in the way that children are talking about their developing knowledge of the topic they're learning about. The second part of the previous sentence was, leaders provide effective support. And that will be, you gather some of that evidence from how teachers recall the support and advice they've been given, how they talk about the impact that the session in the staff meeting or the inset session that had been led about the subject you're leading, how they'd found that useful and how they'd taken that advice and guidance given and have actually put it into practice. So it's not just about saying from the left-hand side of the screen that yes, we do. We need to be able to demonstrate it by looking for evidence. So my suggestion is that you look at the other criteria on the 3 I's. They're all in the subject leader resource files. Part D of those files includes the Ofsted criteria for implementation, impact, and intent. And my advice will be, go through those just to highlight what you consider and then share that with your colleagues to be the key command words, and then identify, where would I get evidence to back that up, rather than me just saying it? Because the whole thing about evaluation, it is rooted in evidence. So, and how do I then now? So I'm out there, I've done it, I'm going into class, I'm going to do some observing, I'm going to look at some children's work, and then I'm going to make some notes at the end of it. So just a few little things, and this is my little, if you remember, this is a little aid memoir. So when I write it up, I'm going to make a judgment about something being good or maybe not quite good enough yet, and I'm going to back it up with an example from what I've observed, having seen children in a learning situation or talking to them and actually looking at evidence of prior learning. So here's just one example. And there's the red bit is the bit which I would say is making a judgment. Because if we just read it through, it says, by the end of Key Stage 1, pupils understand. So that's where I see, that's my judgment. They understand. And what do they understand? They understand, because this is a history we're looking at, they understand the chronology of what they have studied, what they've been learning. And they understand, because they've got a developing knowledge of historical concepts. So I've started off by making a judgment. And then in blue underneath, I've then backed it up by giving an example that I've observed by having been in class, been talking to the pupils, because the pupils are able to, they begin by considering their own personal history in early years, and then they move on to studying important events and significant people. So I'll have had experience of observing or talking to the children and them telling me, or me seeing them describing their personal histories, as well as the Great Fire of London and some key people, and actually being able to put them into some form of a timeline, which enabled me to say, they understand the chronology of what they've been learning. So the whole point of, hope I haven't labored it too much. The whole point being, I've made a judgment and I've backed it up. So I could tell a visitor, an inspector, yes, the children by the end of Key Stage 1 do have a good understanding of chronology. And this is how I know that, by then reciting the example that I've provided. Here's another one. Pupils are confident with using terms such as sea, ocean, country, and continent, and they can conceptualize distance to faraway places such as China and South America, i.e. they could locate where they were on a map and they could relate them in relation to where they are in West London in terms of distance and maybe time it would take to get there on an aeroplane, etc., etc. And why was I able to say that? Because the teachers, because they're using that language so confidently in lessons. Why they're using it so confidently? Because the teachers are continuously reinforcing it and modeling it. So I'm making a direct connection there between the judgment, because they're confident, with the quality of the teaching that backs it up. But I hope you've sort of seen in just these two little examples, I've started each of them off by talking about the learner and then backing it up with an example from what I've seen. And in the second one, from an example that actually, well, I saw it and I heard it because the teachers were constantly modeling the correct use of subject-specific language. So I just offer those as two little examples of ways to think about how might I present my self-evaluation report. And writing about positive things is so much easier than writing about any aspects of teaching and learning that you would identify as an even better if. And I propose just the following as some suggestions as how you can still make your point, but you can make it in such a way that you're not saying this is not good enough yet. You know it's not good enough, and you'll probably explain to me if I was the inspector, Andy, this is not quite good enough yet. And this, but more importantly, in a sense, this is what I'm doing about it. And ideally, if you can demonstrate some green shoots, i.e. where it's getting that little bit better, then I would have every confidence in terms of please, almost saying to you, please just keep on doing what you're doing. So I just thought these were sort of gentler ways of saying something's not quite good enough yet, or if this is still even better. So, there remains work to do. But clearly, there is some work taking place, which is deepening those aspects of pupils' knowledge. Currently, pupils are not given enough opportunities. Well, more than likely, they are in some areas of the school, in some classes, year groups, etc., but it's not consistent in all classes and year groups. The third one, staff are beginning to deploy. Maybe they weren't consistently applying those strategies before, but they're now, so to speak, they're getting better at deploying those strategies. So the graph is going upwards. Likewise, the final one, curriculum planning now also sets out how teachers can deepen. So maybe it didn't beforehand, the planning didn't set it out as clearly as it is now, but it is now starting to take place. So it's identifying, so the subject leader is identifying, it's not quite good enough yet, but in all these instances, the graph is going upwards. Okay, so and I just put that in there because I know people always find it harder to write about something, especially within their own school, if they've got evidence that indicates it's not quite good enough in a certain classes or certain parts of the school. It's like, how do I say that without upsetting, offending, or identifying an individual year group, class, or teacher? And I just think, consider some of the language of this. I'm not saying it's the be all and end all, but it is a way of still getting the message across about what you need to do. But it doesn't actually, sort of, without being disrespectful, name or shame anybody. And it's clearly, this is not about that, but it's about saying, I know, and we as a school know, there's something here which is not consistently good. Therefore, this is a subtle form of words to actually present that. And no inspector will ever say to you, well, tell me which class isn't good enough yet, so to speak. That's not part of it. It's just about, I'd be more impressed the fact that you've identified something which isn't quite good enough. And I then want to know, so what are you doing about it? And as I said, if there was any opportunity, you could say, well, actually, I've seen a bit of a green shoot in this part of the school. And over time, I'll see more green shoots. That would lead me to have every confidence in your ability to develop this even further. So in summary, remember, it's evaluation and it's not description. So evaluation is about making judgments, is saying whether it is good enough or it is not quite good enough yet. And it must be based upon evidence. And the evidence is from the learning observations, talking to pupils. So, and I'll keep repeating this, but there is a danger we can write an awful lot of, I've done this, I've done that, we're doing this, we're doing that, and so forth. But it's, you must, if you're going to write about that, you must always back it up in terms of, so what difference is it making? What is its impact? And on the basis of all that, as I started off this session, I'm saying the outcome of any evaluation will be then your action plan, because anything you're thinking is still an area that could be even better. And it may well be that it's not good enough. It's still good, but it might not be as good as some other aspects of children's learning of the subject you lead. And you think, you know what, this could be even better than it is. And that's what we're going to focus on. So an action plan doesn't have to always be on, as it were, a weakness in terms of it's not good enough. It could be because actually there's so much about children's learning which is exemplary, but there's a particular aspect which is not quite as good as, and I'm so driven, I want to improve it so that all aspects of children's learning in this subject are exemplary. And on the basis of that, I'd have to say that is really ambitious, and it would be a real credit to you. Right. Well, I do hope you found this session of value, like the previous two sessions and the associated materials that go along with it. And as it says at the bottom, so to speak, if you've got any questions, comments or feedback, send them to me directly or to colleagues at the Hounslow Education Partnership. And I thank you for listening, and I do hope it's been of value.